What is the difference between mixing and mastering? And yes, there is a difference. And at the end, I'll give you some tips if you are going to master the music yourself. First off, it should be mixing and mastering. Two separate things. They are not the same thing. I don't know how to do mixing and mastering, but it's two separate stages, right? Right? Just as a side note, I've only just got set up in this studio. This is my home studio, and I did not choose that wallpaper, by the way. So traditionally, there are always three main stages to the recording process. The tracking phase, which would be where you go into the studio, you record each part individually. The drums, usually first, the bass, the guitars, the vocals, it would be something like that order. And if you go back even further, then a lot of the time microphones would just be set up in the room and the whole band would play together and you'd get more of a live recording sound. But anyway, I digress. The second phase would be the mixing stage. So you've got all those instruments, you've got all those tracks, whether it was on a 4-track recorder, 8-track, 24, whatever, tape, and now digital. So you've got all those individual tracks. Then you need to get them all to sound good together because all of these things layered up on top of each other, there's not going to be a whole lot of clarity, so you need to mix it. And what about the timing issues between the bass and the drums? All those different vocal takes, you need to comp them. So this would be the mixing stage, using EQ, compression, and many other effects processing to get them to sound good together. That's the goal of the mix, to make it sound good together, well balanced. Some mixes are unbalanced. You might hear some mixes with super heavy guitars, for instance, and the vocals might be a little bit further back if that's the style, but that's also another story for later. Okay, so now you've got a good sounding mix. Then there's one more stage, the third stage, and that is mastering. And this is why I'm banging on about there being a difference between mixing and mastering, because usually, traditionally, it was always a completely separate third person, because that person can listen to the mix objectively. It's kind of like a quality control, and their job was to get it ready for distribution. So whether that would be vinyl, CD, now digital, their job was to make sure it's going to work on all of those formats and to sound good as all the other tracks in that genre. Let me give you an example. Say if you were building a car, mixing would be the assembly of the car, putting in the seats, the steering wheel. What else do cars have? The brakes, the wheels. Mixing would be assembling that all together, and at the end, yeah, you have a car that can drive on the road. But then mastering would be putting on the paintwork, let's say, and the polish so that it looks good in the showroom, it looks good on the road, and it looks like all the other cars out there. That would be mastering. Also like putting the icing on the cake. It's that kind of last 10% or so of the production process. So what are the differences between mixing and mastering? Well, usually a master is just a single stereo 2-track. 2 channels, left, right. Whereas a mix and a mixing project is going to contain 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, some mono, some stereo, and later on I'll show you the difference between a mix and a master project. So usually the master is a WAV file or an AIFF file. Many people think that a mastering engineer, or ME, I'm going to refer to them as, an ME's job is to just make a track louder. And a lot of people think that mastering is just the case of putting a limiter on your stereo track within your mix project, and that is it, done, mastered. That is not mastering. That really isn't. And if that's all you're doing for mastering your track, you are doing yourself a big disservice. Now, while getting commercial loudness is part of the ME's job, and their job is to make sure that your track sounds as good as other people in your genre's tracks, they've got to sound full, rich, loud, professional sounding, that is their job. They do much more than just making it louder. They do much more than just adding a limiter, let's say. If I have to read any more articles or Reddit posts about how your track has to be minus 14 LUFS, I think I'm gonna go crazy. That is a topic for another video though. So as well as making a track louder, mastering engineer will also make it generally sound good. That could be boosting the highs a little, it could be increasing the lows, it could be, and it quite often is, reducing the lows, because most kind of home studio producers don't always have the best monitoring setup, and often their monitoring of the bass and the low end can often be wrong. They often overcook it. So quite often, and in a master I'm going to show you later on, what I had to do for that one was control the dynamic in the low end. Rather than just creating louder tracks, they generally enhance the sound of your production. So they're also doing quality control. They're going to check for anything you might have missed, which is very likely. You've got 100 channels to look over, and what you're hearing in your room might not be an accurate picture if you don't have proper acoustic treatment, let's say. Maybe you had some phase issues you weren't aware of, or some balancing issues, or something with the stereo field, maybe it was too wide, or maybe some dynamics need a bit more control. A mono compatibility check, let's say. All of these things the mastering engineer is going to check to make sure it's going to sound good on as many systems as possible. And another thing that often gets overlooked with mastering is the fact that they are going to look at the whole track, not just like individual channels or individual parts of the track, which you do at the mixing stage. They're kind of see it as a whole track, a broad picture, and they're going to kind of listen with how the listener's going to hear it. Because if you've been working on a track for 3 months, you know every intricate detail of that track and you are obsessed with these things essentially. But the mastering engineer is going to have fresh, objective ears and just be like, oh, well, clearly your top end is way too bright. And you're like, really? And you're like, yeah. But you've been working it for so long, you kind of become deaf to certain things because you've heard it so many times. So yeah, the mastering engineer is going to look at the track as a whole. So the processes involved actually aren't too dissimilar from each other. You're still going to use EQ, compression, limiting, which you're probably also using in your mixes. But I'd say a big difference here is you're going to use generally a lot smaller brush strokes when it comes to mastering. In mixing, you might be boosting things 5 to 10 dB, but in mastering, it's going to be 0 to 3 dB, let's say. That's not a hard rule, but just generally, the tweaks are smaller. The mastering engineer is going to make sure your track sounds good on all formats, basically. So that might just be digital, but they're going to get the track ready for digital distribution, CD distribution, vinyl distribution. So for instance, if your song was being cut to vinyl, they might realize that there's way too many sub-frequencies panned left and right. And that's going to create a big problem for the cutting lathe. Needle is going to jump out because of those frequencies when it's being cut to vinyl. So it's things like that that the mastering engineer will take care of. And also mastering isn't just limited to one song. So a lot of the time, if you've made 10, 11, 12 tracks and you've mixed them, they might sound different volumes to each other. They might have different tonal balances. They might not sound as a collection of tracks, but a mastering engineer can apply processing to those in a way that they flow better between them, whether that's with fade-ins, fade-outs, with the choice of EQ, with the choice of dynamics, setting those volumes. They can kind of set a tone across multiple tracks. If you've ever finished an album, you might realize, oh my gosh, these tracks sound all so different to each other. And then some mastering can actually make them sound more like one complete body of work. Now let's take a look at a mixing project and a mastering project, and you should be able to spot the differences quite easily. All I've got, as you can see, is a stereo file, left channel here, right channel here, and my processing is there on the left, and there I've got just a meter, got span on the output. And as we talked about earlier, you can see I've got EQs, got a compressor there, multi-band compression, EQ, and I actually use a touch of reverb on this track, and then a limiter at the end. So how does it sound? So I'm going to bypass everything. I parked myself down in parallel form. Okay, so for me the bass is a little bit loud. That's like the main thing. I also wanted to bring the guitars up a little bit, and I also wanted to let the vocal come out a little bit more. I also wanted to bring out the airiness as well as bringing up the overall level a little bit. So this is it. I parked myself down in parallel form, right beside the moonbeams. I parked myself down in parallel. Okay, so the bass is a little bit more controlled, a little bit tighter, a little bit less boomy. Guitars have come up a little bit, vocals come up a little bit. Overall, I've brought up the level. I've kind of given it a bit more sheen, a bit more polish, made stuff a bit more clear, made it more in line with commercial tracks in terms of volume. That is what a mastering project looks like. So now let's flip over to a mix. And as you can see, there's a lot of tracks in this. This looks more like your standard project. Get a combination of stereo and mono tracks. And if you look at the mixing window, you can see all the different volumes here, the panning, EQs, a lot of EQ used, compressors, envelopes, And then I've got buses and things down this end. So hopefully you can see that there is a big difference between a mixing project and a mastering project, which will be very obvious to some of you, but if you're newer to this, then you might not realize. And here's what this one sounds like. I'll just play a little bit of it. So one thing you should be able to see that there is a great deal of benefit from exporting this when you're done with the mixing into a new project for mastering, because you get rid of all this distraction, you get rid of all this clutter, and you've just got one thing to focus on. And it's not like you can just go in and change the lead synth a little bit. It commits you, it forces you to make decisions, essentially. A great way to learn more about mastering is by attempting to do it yourself. So if you do wish to do it all, then here is what I would do. My own music that's used on TV, etc., goes to a separate mastering engineer. I would recommend having someone else master the music for you, just because you get that objectivity. And they probably have better acoustics and a better monitoring system than you do, not to mention their experience doing it. But anyway, if you are going to do it yourself, here's what I would suggest you do. First tip would be to separate your mix from your master. Don't just master the track by adding the plugins on your two-bus. What really helps is to export your file from the mixing session and export it as a WAV, AIFF, and then put it into a new project, a new file. And so you've just got that one stereo file that you're looking at. It takes you out of the mixing stage and puts you in the mastering stage, and it puts you in a different mindset. You're not looking at all those different channels and what you could change. You're now just looking at the overall picture. And although this is maybe just a little symbolic thing, I think it really helps you self-master your own work. And the second main tip I would give you is to take some time from when you finish the mix. If you think you're happy with the mix, give it a week, give it 2 weeks before you then go and master it. So you come back with fresh ears and you're listening to the overall track rather than all the individual pieces so much. You've had some time, your brain's kind of zoomed out from it, and you can be a little bit more objective. Okay, so that was some of the main differences when it comes to mixing and mastering. There are actually quite a lot, so if I've forgotten some, let me know in the comments what you think about mixing and mastering. Do you do it yourself? I didn't touch on online services because personally I'd rather have a human do my mastering than an algorithm, but that's just my personal taste. And yes, I do offer mixing and mastering for clients all around the world. I've been working with audio for around 20 years now, done mixing for TV, composing for TV. So if you are considering having your track mixed or mastered, then please do go to my website, ammusic.co.uk, and there you can find some links to previous work, testimonials, and if you want to get in touch, then please do so. You'll also find a load of free courses and free sample packs on there, so feel free to dive in. I hope this helps.